So, hello everybody and welcome to this session. This is the third in the series and this session is entitled Racial Capitalism, Actually Existing Capitalism. I'm really excited to have Ashok and Gargi here just to talk through some of these questions that I've been sort of working through myself, and I think it's especially topical given recent happenings in America around Reed and conversations that have been happening in the last few months around the question of Black Lives Matter and how do we square this question of the relationship between race and capital. So what I'm going to do just to get started is to give both Ashok and Gargi opportunity to introduce what they're sort of thinking about in this moment and tying some of their recent work to questions that are being raised in this moment. I'm going to start with Ashok.
Thank you. Thanks, Annie, for the invitation, and I'm really happy to join Gargi in the discussion. I think the most important way to think of race, just to begin with, is in terms of racialization rather than race as a category. If we see this as a kind of ongoing process of contestation to sort of ensure the stability of class relations and profit maximization or capitalism, then we could focus more on the kind of structure and the process rather than sort of in defense of certain categories. And I'm sort of using Cedric Robinson's work as a foil, but this isn't a kind of textual analysis of that. It's just to like begin a discussion. So like, what is racial capitalism? First, this category is like really recently been deployed to emphasize the centrality of race within capitalism. Like, for example, my book is called Monopsony Capitalism. That's not me using this as an opportunity to plug my book, but it's that it's called Monopsony Capitalism. And that's not to say that the economic relationship known as monopsony is a separate phenomenon than from capitalism. But, you know, sort of conjoin the two to emphasize the centrality of monopsony within capitalism. And so a lot of people use racial capitalism just as a point of trying to emphasize race within capitalism. But the second, I think, more problematic use of it is racial capitalism as it's formulated by Cedric Robinson in his text, Black Marxism. This Robinson formulation is important because it goes to the sort of heart of some of the serious debates over the relationship between race and capitalism. So, and it sort of helps us understand the relationship between the universal and the particular. So does race predate capitalism? You know, trying to answer that question triggers a series of other questions. So can there be a capitalism without racism, or is it always racial? And this helps us really try to tease out how to confront race and capitalism so that ultimately we can end both of them. Simply a kind of Marxist way of analyzing race has always been that it functions to facilitate the dispossession of land and the exploitation of labor. Whereas Cedric Robinson argues that the Eurocentrism inherent in Marxism means that class relations are inadequate in understanding Black life and history. To Robinson, the history of race is autonomous to the capitalist mode of production. So you had this, you know, he sort of traces race as a kind of continuum from antiquity to the present, and it's basically it's sort of animated in different modes of production. So why is this important? Many people have adopted the ideas of Robinson to develop a more universal and transhistorical conception of race that centers sort of Blackness as always and immutably being at the bottom. Those who have been influenced by Robinson maintain that a historical phenomenon, so like transatlantic slave trade or say colonialism, is a powerful enough event that its hierarchical framework then structures the entire world. I don't really think that's, you know, there's a lot of problems with that, but let's say that's true. The problem with that is that itself is Eurocentric. It suggests that the sort of agents of history are white Europeans. Like they create a world with its various racial hierarchies. They sort of create a strict hierarchy, and that we continue that tradition into the present. It's never really contested. But that's just not history, right? That's fallacious, because there's a number of examples. I can just think of a handful, like Sri Lanka as an example of this. Sri Lanka under British colonialism used a small section of the population, the Tamils, so 20%, to implement or enforce or administer, or at least administer, colonialism. So they were put at an elevated position under colonialism. Immediately following colonialism, they are systematically marginalized and quite literally genocided up until about 10 years ago, and they're still very, very marginalized. So there's there's an example of how that hierarchy isn't fixed. It's contested because people also, the colonized also have agency. Another example is Uganda. Ugandan Indians were placed at an elevated position as a kind of comprador bourgeoisie that implemented and administered the colonial order and made durable the colonial order. And then they become a kind of, they're sort of to some extent subjugated by the majority once the decolonial process happens, and they're sort of famously deported. Many of them are. My friend John Baptiste talks about a similar phenomenon in Kenya, where you have in the western parts of the state a sort of an elevated population that then is marginalized and underdeveloped following the decolonial process. So there are many other examples, but Robinson tries to transform what is the Black Marxist tradition into what he calls the Black radical tradition, which he claims was a direct opposition to Marxism, that Black and Marxist were contradictory. He claims that people like Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, C.L.R. James, were actually part of a kind of mythic Black radical tradition, due in part to their rejection of the working class as an agent of change. That's simply not the case. The reason that Robinson thinks he's entitled to turn away from the focus between the clash between labor and capital in favor of a confrontation between the West and the colonized world is because he says conceiving class struggle kind of presupposes a Western way of thinking or a Western epistemology or whatever. So in my book, Monopsony Capitalism, I look at workers in the garment and footwear sectors in about half a dozen countries over the last 100 years. And what we find is that the industrial working class in the global South, the industrial disputes that they're taking part of are exactly the same as the ones, or almost exactly the same as the ones that Robinson claims only exist in the West. Workers aren't making explicitly racial demands. The demands are consistently and explicitly class demands. But, I suppose because of their position and because of the colonial past, those demands and uneven development, those demands are implicitly racial, right? I look at the industrial sectors with the highest rates of exploitation, which is heavily gendered, right? It's about 80% women in these sectors. So racial demands and class demands are often the same thing. Even Du Bois describes the Civil War as, quote, a general strike of the slaves. It's clear he sees race and class as the same thing. Right now, the people claiming that what ex-colonized countries ought to do is embrace an alternative non-European racialized forms of politics are basically liberal nationalists or explicit fascists. You see this in South Africa, for example, when nationalist arguments are used to deploy or suppress, or are deployed to suppress industrial disputes. But if we look at it as a sort of racialization rather than race, it's probably easiest to see the gendered division of labor as very much functioning as race does in these sectors, right? Gender is far more kind of globally similar than race. It's not the case that those with the darkest skin, for example, are toiling in industries with the highest rates of exploitation. But it is the case that women, by and large, in industrial capital are working in spaces with the highest rate of exploitation. So why are these sectors so gendered? Just as with race, women can be exploited more because of the social context of ideological subordination as races. Simply, you can get away with paying women less. Similarly, women's limited access to the labor market means that so they can't access other forms, other parts of the labor market, means that you have a large reserve army of labor, a reserve army of the unemployed, which means you can increase the rate of exploitation in the sectors where they are employed because you have so many people who need that work and they can't find jobs in other places. And finally, the ongoing centrality of women in social reproduction, so that's kind of unpaid labor in the home, makes organization harder and therefore rates of exploitation greater. So women-only hiring practices produce a clear gender division of labor within the factory. So women sew, cut, press, and clean what men design. Women operate machines that men service. Women work on the factory floor while men stand guard. Women toil while men manage, so on and so forth. Women's work invariably results in less pay than what is defined as men's work. In addition to questions of skilled and unskilled labor, workers are hindered by sort of gendered ideas of self-organization and power. So I'm going to end with this sort of illustrative example. A sort of factory manager in Gurgaon near Delhi sort of explains why he and other managers prefer women in the shop floor. So he's asked, why are your garment workers mostly female? Are there significant differences in production? The manager responds, no significant differences in production. Just men together tend to form groups and lobbies because they have spare time. a follow-up question, what groups? And the manager responds, oh, they get involved in politics. Women are easier to handle. They're docile, easier to control. So I'm ending with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashok. So next I'm going to invite Gargi to introduce her.
Okay. Hi. Once again, I've come to the wrong exam with the wrong pencil case, haven't I? So I hadn't really understood that we were going to say, is there any point talking about racial capitalism? And dreadfully, I feel like I ought to defend Cedric Robinson a bit. I mean, I can hear what you're saying. Robinson is very keen to say Western Marxism cannot encompass many sites of anti-capitalist struggle because of a quite narrow idea of who the political subject can be, who the proletarian subject can be, and who has the ability to change history. So I always think that when he's talking about the black radical tradition, it's not this instead of that, it's this is only this bit. If you really want to see freedom, you have to have these bits as well. And I think some of what you're saying about a kind of essentializing of blackness isn't really Robinson, although I can see that he is used in that way. I mean, I think there's something different going on in this moment. Robinson ends Black Marxism with this lovely bit about saying, this might not be the only story. There are many other stories, but this is the bit of the story that I've been telling. It's a kind of opening to say, look, the point is to see who is the anti-capitalist subject. What good is it for any of us living like this if we don't see the whole range? So instead, I think the three things when I try and summarize Robinson's idea of racial capitalism, firstly, I don't think you have to, it's not like a religion. You had this religion, now you get this one. It's like, well, is there something politically and analytically useful for us? And the three things I think Robinson puts forward, which I think now seem so commonsensical, that it's almost like, why did you write that? But in 83, certainly in my experience, and that was quite early in my educational career, people were not saying it so clearly. So one, very carefully documenting the ways in which at that point, very prevalent view that capitalist development will eventually will proletarianize us in similar ways so that we become almost interchangeable subjects. That's questioned not at all about looking at blackness, but looking at how the use of ideas of religious and national identity in pre-capitalism and in early modernity is used to kind of, so that you can put in divisions of labour onto pre-existing or kind of forms of identity. And then how we might think that going forward, because I think it's pretty clear now in the 21st century that however we are getting swiped by capitalism, it isn't by being made as one interchangeable subject or similarity. So I think that's still worth thinking about. And when I've finished on Robinson, I'd like to say what I hope we're going to talk about a bit more about what's happening now. Then he has this whole gripe, which again feels so 20th century, because you need to think like he's writing before the fall of the Soviet bloc. There's a whole different set of things going on in Western Marxism. But that strong kind of, again, I can only say almost religious zeal, which saw historical materialism as one trajectory, that if you believe strongly enough, you'll pass through the stages. I once was in the Asiatic mode of production, but here I am going through, and freedom is out there. And Robinson is almost like disabusing people, saying, yeah, we all want to be free, but just reasserting again and again that this is the one trajectory of history and that everyone will pass through these stages is not historically astute. You're not looking at the places in which certain kinds of anti-capitalist struggle have taken place. And that's why, because of his own interest and positioning, he's most interested in particular in slave rebellion and how would you think of Haiti as a kind of formative anti-capitalist struggle which doesn't fall within these parameters of what would make an anti-capitalist subject? And the last one is, well, who gets to be the anti-capitalist subject if there's only one kind of industrial worker who is modelled on a mid-19th century model that even by the mid-20th century is quite hard to pin on the range of workers? Doesn't look like we're going to make it. What instead if we think about a variety of forces and practices? And this bit I think is his most optimistic and equally in some ways least convincing bit. And if anyone could convince me a bit more because it helps me wake up in the morning. Robinson pretty much says, if you want to see who resists, you need to see who's oppressed most. That the process of being oppressed ignites this possibility of resistance. And that's partly cultural, it's partly locational, it's partly material, but it's something about that antagonistic moment. And of course, that's great because because it means every time they kick us, we're going to kick back harder. Who doesn't want to hear that? I need to hear that every day, otherwise I can't make it through. But I also think, I'm not so old that I'm looking for scientific socialism, tell me the answer. But I still think you need some analytic process that lets you assess what political possibility is, to think about what are motives of change in different places. Of course, people kick back in many ways, in many places. And I also think we're in a moment where people are more open to saying, well, maybe we don't know which kind of kicking back is going to be the one that works. And perhaps that's how it's always been. That, some people are thinking, oh, if I can lay the bet, I'd bet on you. But everyone else in the process of trying to survive is just kick, 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 and hope this kick will knock them over, make a route. But there's something in that, in the analysis of racial capitalism, which opens our imagination of what the political subject can be. And I think we need that now. And we need it because, going back to the title, I think there could be a non-racial capitalism, because I think capitalism can remake itself in any which way it wants. If it came to a point where that worked, to abandon the logics of race worked, of course it could do it. I've seen in my lifetime an extreme change in how the great captains of capitalism globally talk about issues of gender and family. That doesn't mean they're not exploiting poor women in the world, just as Ashok has said. But we've seen that in the last 50 or 60 years. Suddenly the World Bank is saying, I'm going to screw you, but oh no, women in parliament. You think, whoa, that means they can do anything. They can come and say, oh, you homophobes, I'll have to take your surplus value because you're such backward homophobes. Oh, you peasants, you don't like minorities, let capital save you. All of that is within the space of development speak already. So I think that's all true, and yet we've not seen it yet. So maybe capitalism doesn't have to be racial, but we've not yet, any of us, seen a history in which it has not been. And not because there's a static hierarchy, but because the odd kinds of illogical categorizations of populations that we all inhabit then are parasitically inhabited again by capital as it comes to our spaces of living. So that we live with those differences. We accept those differential hierarchies. Sometimes we don't even accept them, we just don't see each other. The practices of racialization mean that this group of workers will only ever do a night shift. And so it works for them to do different conditions, different pay, different levels of protection and lack of protection by the state. So I think the term racial capitalism is that just because people who have a certain view of how freedom is never possible have taken it up, it doesn't belong to them. It's a way of thinking about the ways in which the logics of race can be used in capitalist development, can inform ways in which capitalist expansion comes into different territories or makes territory differently, including temporal kind of territories. So suddenly a night economy, suddenly an early morning economy. And most of all, it's a way of starting to think about why it's so very, very difficult for us to be together. Because I think, the absolute question is, none of us can survive this. Is a way of us getting out of it, which is not together? I don't think there is. And so then the only political question is, what are the things that are stopping us being together? And I think racial capitalism is just one of the ways in which people have tried to say, well, what are the questions about what is stopping us being together? And I've talked for much longer than I thought I would, sorry. That's it.
Amazing, thank you so much, Gargi. So I'm just going to I've got so many questions that have also come out of what we just heard there. So I think what I'm trying to piece it together. But I think what was great about both of those sort of introductions was I think it was a very thorough response to people who want to think of race and capitalism as separate travelers who happen to intersect at one point, but then either place far too much emphasis on capitalism or class, or far too much emphasis on race. And I think one of the sort of helpful ways for me in terms of thinking about it has been in understanding race as something which has transformed the nature of capital, which is what I think that Black Marxists in the 20th century were trying to sort of put across as the politics. I think also at the same time, capital is something which has been, race has transformed capital, but capital also transformed race. And that is something that I think maybe we haven't talked about so much. And I think that's something that we can sort of try to unpack to some extent. And I was just thinking about in your comments, Gargi, about the ways in which this sort of strict up, and tying that to what Ashok was saying as well, the ways in which this presumption of an overall hierarchy of race, which is static, inhibits our capacity to understand those dynamics of the ways in which capitalism has changed race and the ways in which race has changed capitalism. And I think the best formulation I've seen so far is by this guy called Bruce Berman. I was like late night writing an essay while I was in my undergraduate, and like came across this article, and I just keep going back to this language. So he uses this metaphor of a palimpsest, which is to say, in the process of colonization, bearing in mind firstly that colonization initially is not a state project, it's a project of capital. Companies then sell those territories to states, but that's something that's often forgotten about that process. And they say they're confronted with this contradiction between the need to accumulate, or the desire to accumulate, and also the need to have some form of legitimacy in accumulation. And that's where you see the emergence of various classes and forms of collaboration. But also that's, I think, where they sort of analyze this need for ethnicity, or this need to stabilize race or ethnic or cultural belonging in that way. And I think one of the ways in which it's been helpful for me is also in understanding this process of coalescing around certain races as being happening in tandem with and parallel to the process of becoming proletarian subjects. So blackness is not something or a language which is available to most people on the continent at the point of colonization. It's a language which becomes possible because of the processes of work and the process of urbanization, which bring all of these different groups together who don't share a language but suddenly forced to learn English or French or Portuguese in order to be able to compete in the job market, right? And I think that some of the issue with the way in which race is read as something transhistorically which exists separately from capitalism is that it stops us, it inverts that process. It says when they come into the urban centre, they are black. They don't discover that blackness through the urban centre. That blackness is not created by the urban centre. So I think that's definitely something really interesting. I wanted to just invite you both, because I noticed that in both of your work, you speak so much about the question of gender and the questions of essentially social reproduction. And so I wanted to invite you both sort of to speak on that, in particular the ways in which the acute exploitation of women through both race and gender has an impact on the way that we sort of form ourselves as subjects, but also the ways in which we understand ourselves as belonging in the context of capitalism. Either of you could jump in first.
Okay, I'm gonna try and start a bit, because I thought, I think all those things, all of the markers that we think of as identities of the body, gender, race, sexuality, disability, all of them can be remade and reordered through capital, and are done every day. And that just because it seems, of course, there's a whole kind of burning evidence of how those bodies coded as women and female are seen to do certain kinds of work. And yet all of that can be turned in an instant. And again, I'll just point to our own lifetimes. But all the better paid women who work in the global north, whose social reproductive labour, although they're still doing more than their male counterparts, is then outsourced in different ways. And not always to those who have bodies coded as women. They could be outsourced to those with bodies coded as male, or just not coded differently in gendered ways. That's all up for grabs. So I don't think we should think that capitalists, just as much as you say that the racial naming that we find so naturalistic can only be imagined through a certain capitalist history, I think we should start to think that the kind of gendered naming equally has a history that, if not exclusive to that capitalism, is so embedded now in a certain kind of idea of the household, the productive unit, the link between the family and production, that it's like it's stolen all of our body parts for that story of self, and that all of the other more diffuse ways in which our bodies are not only about making babies for the production process are kind of lost. So I just start with that. But I do also think, and this is partly what I've been trying to work on, and the last thing I worked on, I'm trying to work on it again, is I think there's something in the idea of racial capitalism which says capitalism scrapes and steals value from all your human and non-human lives. It does it through the wage, but guess what? It does it through some other ways as well. It invites us to think, well, if not through the wage, what are all the other ways in which we become just receptacles of free value for capital? And I think that's the whole sphere of social reproduction. And some of it might be all this kind of heteronormative, look at me and my kids, look at me and my small hands doing small hand women's work. But I also think it's much bigger than that. It's about trying to understand the ways in which all human and non-human life gradually gets kind of sucked into this machine in which no one's life matters because there's this other imperative which is really against life. Now I sound like a crazy demonic kind of creature, so I'm going to stop and hope that one of you will say something more close to the question.
No, Gargi, I agree with everything you said. I think on the first point, before I get to Annie's, on Robinson, it's similar to the critique around Edward Said's work. You know, the original work is far more useful and I'm far more sympathetic to and far more materialist than some of the people who've interpreted it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a very fair point. On the question of social reproduction, I think, you know, it's like, because I said the importance of talking about racialization as this kind of ongoing process rather than race, because it becomes more dynamic to talk about racialization and seeing the roles that in different contexts, even if something isn't clearly defined as a racialized subject, you can see these processes at play. And I think this is where questions around social reproduction come in. For example, China, after the fall of the bamboo curtain, becomes an essential part, after the crisis really of the advanced capitalist, specifically in the US and the British context of 1973, there was a necessity in the crisis of profitability for industrial capital to produce with cheaper raw materials, a more compliant state, and really cheap labor and surplus labor. And China was a perfect way of absorbing that without having runaway inflation. And so China becomes essential to the stability of global capitalism. But then what is the racialization there? It's not very clear, right? But what you have in China and what remains in China is a system known as hukao. The hukao system means that the place that people are born is where the state or the provinces there are able to provide for their social reproductive needs, right? So it's like when you become old, your land, children, education, so on and so forth. That is where workers and people in China, that's where it's tied to. So once they move to provinces like Guangzhou and Shenzhen in the Pearl River Delta region, very productive areas, none of those provinces need to care for their social reproductive responsibilities. So you have a much more sort of truncated form of social reproduction in where the places they've migrated from, and they're known as migrant workers, even though they're within the Chinese state and they're Chinese citizens. So what you have is a kind of care chain occurring in one place and a production supply chain happening in another place. And that cleavage, that separation, that distanciation is central to increased rates of exploitation, low social wage, and also central to the development of these provinces that didn't have to worry about social reproduction and could just purely accumulate accumulate capital for themselves as provinces in their own engine and necessitate high rates of profit for companies. And so that's where you see this process of racialization really become central. Whereas, are these racialized subjects? I mean, I don't know. I don't really think so. In the classical American chattel slaver descendant version of it, or even indigenous version of it. And I think it's also that. So that's why it's really quite important. I think when we talk about racial capitalism, that we look at the specific context and look at what it means materially. So, for example, another example of this that's more close to home. A recent example is the Leicester workers in Leicester garment district, which produced for like major brands like Boohoo and others. And people must have heard about this. And of course, it was the combined factors of increased wages and production costs around the world, the crisis around COVID that disrupted supply chains, that meant that you had, these companies felt compelled to produce more from places like Leicester. So it increased the domestic production. But it's also the fact that almost all these workers were brown women, earning between £1, if they were earning £1 or £1.50 if they're undocumented, to £4. If they were making £5, they were like seen as the sort of the creme de la creme, and that's significantly lower than the national minimum wage. And it's and the owner of Boohoo is a brown guy, so their exploitation isn't because there's a confusion here, and I don't think anyone in this discussion has this confusion, but where people will say they're exploited because they're brown women. It's like they're exploited because they're workers, but they're exploited especially because they're brown women, because of the factors I was saying before. You have low access to other forms of labor, so you have a high increased reserve army of labor. There's a certain degree of desperation there. The fact that no one really will take the fact that they're being exploited at such high rates in terms of the structure of society or culturally as seriously. Trade unions don't even care to organize them because there's the levels of dehumanization that's both gendered and racialized. And so the question then becomes, would they have been exploited as much if they were white women? Would they have been exploited as much if they were white men? I think the empirical evidence suggests absolutely not. And I'll just lastly say, on the question of the centrality of workers, to go back to Robinson's work and Gargi's point, I think it's really important. I'm going to sound a bit like a vulgar Marxist here, but the reason why Robinson's point of the most exploited workers, and I think this has become a more generalized politics, that we have to find the most exploited workers, or the most oppressed, rather, not exploited, most oppressed workers, and they're the agents of change. Well, I mean, in our analysis of capitalism, that's not necessarily true. I mean, there is a reason why the most valorized sections, the most industrially developed working class, it often becomes able to shut down the levers and critically choke the economy. And I think of 4 examples, really, like chosen at random, but the Tunisian uprising, Egyptian uprising, the Green Movement in Iran, problems notwithstanding, and the red shirts in Thailand. The red shirts and Green Movement had mass popular uprisings in the streets and took squares, but it was only Egypt and Tunisia, again, lots of problems with that, they were able to upend the existing social order to some degree because there was a popular struggle that then resulted in a more general strike of workers in day 16 and 18, respectively. And that was able to bring the government to its knees. So I think it's not necessarily of seeing women workers or black workers or whoever as not important to organize. Of course, it's very important to organize them, and especially if they're the industrial working class. But the centrality of the industrial working class is particularly important when we're talking about revolutionary practices within capitalism.
Definitely. No, amazing. Oh, I'm really happy. Okay, so I've got quite a few.
Can I just say one thing about racialization of it again?
Of course.
So I think anyone can become racialized, and if anything, it might be the other way around, that the process of being confirmed in a lesser status itself becomes racializing. And even though it's a bit anecdotal, look at the way that suddenly Britain within 20 years thought they could see an Eastern European. That's a marker of how the combination of state inaction, lesser labour protections, a certain segmentation in the labour market, all comes together to kind of concoct as if you can see it. Let me tell you, in 1999, no one walked around the streets of Britain saying, oh, I can see this different kind of white person. So that's where you get taught to racialise through this combination of processes, many of which are capitalist processes, but there's also some kind of not quite in sync process around whatever is happening with formal political processes, I think. And I think what I hoped we'd talk about before the end, because I'm very worried about this, I'm also schooled to think that there will be something like the industrial working class who will be the site. But I'm not convinced that in all places, that idea of what the industrial working class does is equally there anymore. And certainly you might look around Britain and Europe and look at what's happening now. So I see absolutely that your field work is in those spaces of intensified, very explicitly industrial production, and what has happened with that, and especially how instead of massifying, it's dispersed and become dangerous. But I think there's a kind of question for us about, well, firstly, you already kind of said, it's an alliance, isn't it? The industrial working class might not be the only factor, but it's a key factor. That's a big difference to say. That's a big difference from 1980s Western Marxism. And I think they couldn't have said it then, and we cannot not say it now. But then even within those chains of alliance, who are in the chains, and what happens when work changes so much? That's really what I am staying awake at night around. So if anyone has got anything to say about that, that'd be great.
All right, so loads of comments on all of that. I just wanted to first say, Ashok, what you were talking about in terms of this cleavage between social reproduction and then labour in a separate space, geographical space. It's really interesting just because I began to sort of think about that question through the lens of Southern Africa, colonized in Southern Africa, where you have the homestead, which is the village where everybody is, subsistence, and then regular sort of migrant labour, internal migrant labour, which is tied to contracts which don't allow you to bring your family into the urban centre, or even like architecturally, it's built around like single flats for single men, essentially. And then, as you were saying, I was thinking about it in the context of like migration into Europe or to the West, like in the sort of decolonization moment or the post-war moment, where a lot of these economies in terms of social reproduction within the global South is dependent on remittance, which is sent from workers who are racialized differently within the metropole. And also just kind of I'm thinking about the way in which I'm moving away from this sort of notion of like any kind of usefulness to an overarching understanding of race. Because it strikes me that when we're talking about the way that race actually functions, we're not talking about generalized stereotypes about Black people, we're not talking about generalized stereotypes around South Asians or East Asians. What we're talking about is the processes which allow for their exploitation, which are the actual things which render them more vulnerable to exploitation, render them more vulnerable, for example, now to coronavirus, to COVID, etc. These processes operate very differently to that overarching structure. So there's also a process of like localized racialization, which I think completely gets missed in conversations about race today, and I don't think people really take it seriously, perhaps because of that lack of historicity. Which brings me to the second point I wanted to make, which is that that struggle to find the most oppressed, and to treat the oppressed as the most oppressed as the revolutionary subject. And I'm thinking about ways in which people talk about, if you're a Black woman, your existence is resistance, your very existence is resistance. And I think that comes from a misreading of why the working class is treated as a revolutionary subject as when Marx is writing. It's not because their radical chains aren't because they're the most oppressed. The radical chains aren't because they don't have, they are relatively better off to like the serf or the peasant, right? Their radical chains are because of the possibility which is created by the way in which they conduct their lives and the way in which they engage with capitalism, which gives them a certain form of power. So in the 20th century, when Black people in America, when the colonized are talking about their position as revolutionary subjects, they're talking about their position as revolutionary subjects because they understand that the process of imperialism and the integration of their economies into the global economy, or the integration of their economies, or the relative dependency, essentially, of the metropole on their labor, renders it vulnerable to them and renders it vulnerable to their struggles. And I think that's something that's often missed or not really talked about. I wanted to spend some time actually reflecting on this thing that Gargi was just talking about in terms of the, looking today. I don't know who that, if I knew the answer to that question, I'd be out on the streets making revolution.
Exactly, not sitting home Zooming again, God.
But I think that's the difficulty, because I feel like so much has changed in the last 40 years. And so much of that change has been under-theorized. Just thinking about the way in which, you use the example of like the people thinking that they can spot an Eastern European. But, the languages which we use to describe ourselves have changed so radically in the last 40 years. Even if you're thinking about going from describing everybody who, Blacks and South Asians as Black in Britain, to this very, granular, am I Bangladeshi, am I Pakistani, am I like Nigerian, like that kind of weird shift has happened. It's been
am I Northeast London Nigerian?
Pardon?
Northeast London, third generation Nigerian from this. Wow.
But I think that's another question, right? So when we talk about this question of legitimacy, I think it's also important to talk about what legitimacy means as inducing consent, right? By fixing itself, or latching itself onto our desires for community, and then producing communities which appear to us as natural because we wanted them, but also act as mechanisms for our further exploitation. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. But it chills me to the bone. But it's true, isn't it? And the other half of what I started to write about, then I couldn't, and I'm going to try and come back to it, that I think there's another part of theorizing racial capitalism, and some of that isn't through a Marxist tradition. There's this whole other kind of critical legal scholarship which talks about racial capitalism really as the self-commodification of ethnicity. So like, if I wear my dupatta in a kind of stylish way and get a job for that, then here I am. Think, what's that? But I think there's something in that in a time in which our economic subjecthood is also kind of, firstly, it has invaded the space of everyday life and leisure, so that, well, there's a whole other discussion, but probably process of accumulation have moved beyond the wage relation. We're always beyond the wage relation, but now through varieties of surveillance capitalism or online culture, there's a whole other way in which we are rendering up our value, not only when at work, and within that, identity, performance, all of those things becoming something else. And I think there's a really big payoff in the processes of racialization, even for those of us who are subordinated. And I'm not sure that was there in such a kind of tricky, hard to dislodge way, even 2 or 3 generations before. Not that people weren't proud and organized, but that kind of endless self-performance and self-confirming around quite minuscule ideas of identity. Again, I sound so old when I say this, so I absolutely accept it might just be age, that younger people might say, oh, shut up, Granny. But it feels like something we must at least engage with. And I don't even mean to engage with, say, oh, how rubbish, get back to your class consciousness. But, that politics has to address people where they are. If this is our reality, then this is the space. There is not some other space where you kind of rip people back to 1950. If people experience themselves as at once over-policed, underemployed, materially deprived, and yet hyper-invested in very particular kinds of racialized identity, even as those racialized identities are used to kick down their doors again, then that's our question. It has to be, hasn't it? Our question is what we live with.
Just quickly before I see Ashok's about to say, I just want to quickly say one teeny thing beforehand. I think one thing that's missing there is that the ways in which that consent is generated is particular racial markers are, sort of separated out, but then a material reality which enables you to benefit from subscribing to that then corresponds to it. So like in Sudan, the pro-colonization process separates out the Arab from the Black. And because all of these additional privileges are conferred onto you, then, in the context of census data, etc., have an incentive to identify yourself as Arab and to perform that Arabness. And I think that element of it is missing in the same way that in the UK, the breakdown of political Blackness coincides with, funding coming for community projects along the lines of particular forms of ethnicity. And so performing that ethnicity, saying, I want to work specifically with Indian youth, or saying I want to work specifically with like Black African or Afro-Caribbean people, it then means that people are forced to inhabit in order to get some of those scraps, those particular identity positions. Sorry, Ashok, now you can get.
No, I agree entirely with that. And I think it's that, if you take, there is a particular set of, this can be a bit controversial, but I'm going to say it. Well, I'll just use myself as an example. When I was growing up, the racism was very, very intense. I was like, I would wish I was anything but brown. But now, ever since I went to university, it was like, there were some real benefits to being brown, right? But that's because my class position is fundamentally different. Also, my relationship to social capital, forms of social capital, etc. And so what happens is that it's like kind of subaltern speak. The people that are speaking, whether it be the Black bourgeoisie or the brown bourgeoisie or the, various classes that are speaking and keeping these identities reified and almost creating gated communities around them because their own forms of accumulation. It doesn't matter that 99% of Black and brown people are suffering under the reification of these identity categories. It's that you're defending it vociferously. You're keeping it alive. You're like reviving it and like making sure that it's actually growing. It's like actually absorbed more and more in society. So if you look at like the recent example of Kamala Harris, her mother's South Asian, her father is Caribbean. And, my friends that I grew up with who were not very political were like online just the other day, were like, oh my God, she's not really the descendant of slaves. So I was like, well, I don't really even want to get into that discussion, but I was like, what are you talking about? Her father's from Caribbean, and that was central to the Caribbean, he's from Jamaica, it's central for the Caribbean slave trade. And they're like, wait a minute, that's not American. So the point was that it becomes if you think like, there's two forms of, I think, the relationship between the particular and the universal, right? If you look at like, not to get too esoteric, but post-colonial theorists, etc., they are obsessed with the particular, like post-structuralists, obsessed with the particular. So they'll say, you'll find all kinds of similarities between workers everywhere, but they'll say, no, that's something particular here, or that particular there. So they particularize that which is universal, right? Whereas then you look at Afro-pessimists and others like that, people who subscribe this ADOS, the African descendants of slaves idea, will universalize the particular. They say the American experience is so bad because of the transatlantic slave trade that it informs the entire world. But then when you get into the nitty-gritty, people will start arguing, no, there's something particular about this group. And then there's something particular about dark-skinned Black descendants of slaves. Then it's like, it becomes more and more in particular. So, more obsessed with the particular. So, and more domesticated and kind of corroding the possibility for internationalism and solidarity, really.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think there's a way in which that route between the particular and the universal either, as you said, either gets completely shut off or gets completely mystified, right? Because that mechanism of understanding how the particular informs the universal is never really interrogated as a sort of either a theoretical question or a methodological question. Instead, it's just taken as a given. And I think, I can't remember who tweeted it, it might potentially have been you, but I saw a tweet the other day about like the only thing that one of the main things that like Black American scholars have in common with like American scholars in general is just their like obsession with US exceptionalism, right? And that exceptionalism can become a form of chauvinism. And the only way in which that can be corrected against is by understanding not just that the experience of the US happens in a silo, or not, just saying that's just completely separate from what's happened to the rest of the world, because it feeds into that. Rather, it's to say that the way in which the language that we have within the academy is shaped is by the dynamics of power that the US Academy has in relation to the academy elsewhere. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say on that line also, it's not to say that there's no universal material process in which we can analyze race. And the best text for this, and I go on about it, and people who know me know I go on about it, is Patrick Wolf's Traces of History, where he actually compares, and he starts off by comparing, he's an Australian sort of theoretician of settler colonialism, and he compares the Aboriginals of Australia, who would be racialized as Black, with the Black and Indigenous tradition, racialization in America. And he says actually the similarities between Black people in Australia and red Indigenous people in America is almost identical, because their relationship to the colonizer, the dominant forces, was one of trying to ethnically cleanse or genocide or culturally genocide a population because you wanted their land. Whereas the descendants of slaves was their importance in terms of labor. So that's a way that we can analyze things in a materialist way that has universal similarities, but also emphasizes the particularities of a situation, but bases itself around a material analysis.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I know I'm going to give Gargi first opportunity to respond, but we have loads of questions.
Yes, I was just going to say that, you know, time is getting on and people are asking things and we're not responding to them at all. So have a bit of a go on accumulation by dispossession in Britain and the US, and then see if we can move on.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so someone quite early on has already said, oh, what about accumulation by dispossession? I suspect everyone in the room knows, but I can't see everyone in the room, so I'm just going to say it quickly. But the term accumulation by dispossession, I think, is popularized by David Harvey, but it's part of a much longer tradition. You know, you can certainly say, well, maybe that's what Rosa Luxemburg is talking about saying that there's one way, which frankly is not even in Marx himself, but is in one tradition of Western Marxism, which says that you used to have primitive accumulation, that how capitalism starts is that people with power and weapons go and steal a load of stuff off the peasantry and other vulnerable people, and that's the first accumulation, and that's primitive because you don't have any industrial process. It's basically just thuggery and thievery, and that's the basis, that's the blood at the heart of what enables capitalist history to begin. And then there's this other trajectory which says, that's kind of true, but doesn't look like the thuggery and thievery ever stopped. Thuggery and thievery is what accumulation by dispossession means. It means that, yes, there's the wage relation where you exploit the worker who has, as Annie's already said, that power, because then suddenly their work becomes this central motor of what creates all surplus value in the system. But alongside that, there's always this, who can I take stuff from? What resources, what land, what bits of labour that I won't pay for, what terms of life, what bits of your family, what things you used to own, what social goods that you can suddenly turn, you know, that's what's been happening with COVID and in Britain, things that used to be almost social goods, you let them be money makers for the hyper rich again. Accumulation by dispossession says that stuff never ended. It's the basis on which capitalism starts, but it's always a strand going alongside the more formal histories of capitalist development that we've seen and monitored. And as a person that I think has already said, of course, some of the biggest and most important ways of thinking about that have been in analyses of settler colonialism and about where, if there's a spatial fix outwards, how do you get that land, how do you get that territory, you erase the population. But it's happening in all kinds of ways today, and I think part of that is about understanding both how racial capitalism is a continuation of racialized histories and always an invention of new racial categories, that both those things are in play. And that, you know, when they finally wipe out the last person who can remember who had rights to this burial ground or rights to this land, they'll just move on. They don't have to keep that subject alive. Oh, let us remember, because there'll be some new fantasy racialized subject. The fantasy racialized subject of the northern town who cannot keep COVID rules, or the fantasy racial subject of the Dunkirk camp dweller who might look like all different kinds of bodies, but somehow is the feral other of the urban space because suddenly we can see them. We're living through it. I don't have to teach you it. You know it. It's in our everyday, what that remaking of accumulation by dispossession does to our boundaries between each other. And that brings me on, I hope, briefly onto the US and the UK, but not just the UK, I think. I think there is a difficulty about thinking about race and politics right now for everyone on the planet, that the dying kind of kicking and screaming of the American empire kind of clouds all of our imaginations, as if everything that happens to them, that's the world. And of course, there's some entertainment in that, but it's not the world, is it? The world is interdependent in the most horrible and violent ways. And if racial capitalism is a question worth asking, and I always think it's a question, it's not a total theory. It's not a saying this is the whole world. It's a kind of question like, if this is how you understand capitalism, what if racial capitalism has some purchase on what works and doesn't work about that theory? It's a question about our planetary interdependence and what it means for some groups of people. It might be changing groups of people to be cast out of humanity and out of the terms of life. And because all of the battles globally are about that, I think it's better for us in Britain, instead of thinking, oh, could we have like a spin-off series of the US racial capitalism? Like, do you used to watch Cheers? None of you are old enough. And Cheers then had that thing about the psychiatrist afterwards. So we'd be like the little spin-off series that'd be like, oh, we'd have a few episodes about UK racial capitalism. That's not the right way to think about it. Instead, it's better to think of a global system of racial capitalism in which the US still has this preeminent space, but the UK plays a slightly different role as 2 centuries ago preeminent imperial centre, as a certain kind of linkage between different kinds of economic spaces, as a kind of repertoire of a certain set of racialized stories. It's even important that we're the ones leaving Europe, because that helps some bits of the story of who can move where, what can be done in this power block can be done. All of that, I think, is part of our story of racial capitalism. And that's why I think it's only worth, and it's always about the other part of the world as well. So that's how I think we should tell it. So I'm talking much too much today. It's because I haven't
Ashok, I'm going to invite you to speak on that, and then we're going to take one more of the questions.
Okay. The spin-off you're talking about is Frasier.
Frasier!
Yeah. It's a terrible show. So
he's a terrible Republican, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a Republican. He loves Trump. So I think when I think about the question about race and accumulation by dispossession, one of the most important texts or theories is put forward by Louis Kant that looks at the kind of relationship between ghettoization, in particular the US, but you can find that in the advanced capitalist world more generally, is that, like, you know, you have a black reserve army of labor or reserve army of the unemployed that's in a sort of subordinated and confined position, both physically, socially, symbolically. And so what you see is basically describes the 20th century that sees like black men primarily shuttled between the prison and the ghetto. And this is what he calls deadly symbiosis. And it keeps this population constantly there as a kind of lever against those who are in full-time employment. So it's like it has the twin goal of both labor extraction and social seclusion. But over time, as you have deindustrialization in the 1970s, what you have is this process of accumulation by dispossession. You're able to, and that happens everywhere. The reason why gentrification happens everywhere isn't because some hipsters moved around. It's because all of a sudden there was no necessity to have this reserve army labor, or even that many industrial laborers in cities, because you have deindustrialization. So whereas historically they say, don't go to the city, it's this dangerous place full of dark people, all of a sudden it was like, that's a dangerous place full of dark people, you want to go there. And so this is the kind of base superstructure relationship that Marx talks about in the German ideology, is that you have a process in which all of a sudden it becomes more and more appealing to move into cities and old industrial places, and then you have the pushing out of this urban working class or reserve army of labor. And that's where gentrification really comes from. It's a kind of relationship of the global processes of industrialization and crisis within capitalism, and how racialization, racial subjectivity is toyed with in order to make appealing forms of labor or land. And that's why I think the interesting thing about Kant's work is how those dynamics not only change, but it's not context specific. It's specific to the advanced capitalist world. And you see forms of this everywhere. I mean, with Paris being the exception, obviously they had this new Haussmannization in the 1800s where they gutted the center of Paris. But I think that's an important text if people are interested in understanding the role of race and the urban subjectivity and labor in terms of the idea of accumulation by dispossession.
Amazing, thanks, Ashok. So just one more question I think is an
is it precarity
question. This question of precarity. I'll let you guys say something on it first, and then I guess it'll be a good place for us to close off, and I'll just say a final little bit. But the question is essentially that there's a sort of argument that precarity has entered into the sort of literature or imagination to comprehend ways in which whiteness doesn't confer a certain degree of security relative to the colonized other or racialized other anymore. So the questions are, firstly, how helpful is this as a way of thinking about race and capitalism? And secondly, what does it get wrong or miss?
Well, it's already in the question, isn't it? That there's certainly in academic literature, and I happen to know in this country there's a kind of trade union discussion as well, which has passed, about really thinking about a more precise kind of wages of whiteness around secure work, better paid work. You know, that's all quite established. I think it's established in the US literature, and some of it's established in some of the European literature around different groups of racialized workers as well. But one of the jobs that racial stratification of the labour force is seen to do is to kind of give white workers, whitens them up through their differential status to the migrant or the racialised other. So you don't do the dirty night shift, they do. You don't have the precarious hours. And I've certainly talked to another part of my life is around different black trade unionists about all laughing and saying that all this talk about precarity, if you talk to black and brown communities in this country, precarious work is our whole history here until quite recently, and still for many, as Ashok has said about Leicester, that still, that's not the new question of the labour market for those who've been racialised, because how under protection by the state, a kind of social context which subordinates and limits your labour market choices, kind of, and actual often some formal barriers imposed by the state around immigration status and a kind of acceptance of discrimination together kind of make people be in that precarious area. So I do think there's something interesting about what happens when precarity becomes widespread. And certainly I do think some of the work I've been doing with people, I think both of you know loads of them, this whole group of us have been writing something about British state racism, that there's something about how the loss of stability in the economy and the labour market is somehow translated to be felt as a loss of white privilege by at least some of the British population. It's kind of interesting. There's something in Brexit which is about a loss, and it's not only a fantastical loss, it is a material loss. It just is the case that people's living standards in this country have become more unstable, actually depreciated for many, many parts of the country in real ways. The access to compensatory social goods has very much been taken away. So it's not a complete fantasy that something has been lost, but there's something interesting going on when those material losses are genuinely experienced as a loss of racialized status. That's some crazy post-imperial shit going on. I don't know how else to say. What is that about? I shut your children's centre and you say, oh, does being white not count for anything anymore? Well, something's gone on in that, the gaps between those two bits. But I do think that means that the extension of precarity does two things. On the one hand, it reveals the fictionality of racialised status. And some of that we're seeing in the most exciting kinds of labour organising in Britain and some other places around the gig economy, that a kind of recognition that precarity dismantles white privilege in the labour market. So now you're all just brown like us. I'd say rude words, but it's like, you all became You all had to work all night and do all the things that we all always had to do. And that shifts the kind of class consciousness and ability to organise for some groups of workers. But on the other hand, as I'd already said, it also unleashes this possibility of white rage around a legitimate grievance translated through the wrong language. And that's a dangerous moment. And equally, we're seeing that, aren't we? Not only here, but around the world. And it doesn't have to be about whiteness. Racialized privilege doesn't have to be about whiteness. It can easily be about Hinduness. It can easily be about, well, anything else. Buddhism, it can be Buddhist identity. That's it. Once the Buddhists also seem as violent as the white racists, you need to think race is not on your skin, it's in your head and in the structures of society. And that's what I think we're living with. This balance between, could the extension of precarity extend a kind of beyond race class consciousness which organises for work in this moment, but to do it, it has to battle against that backlash of the loss of racial privilege. Make everyone go away and cry, but no, don't go away and cry.
Thanks for that. I mean, I guess I would just say, I guess that's a big kind of a more political question in the moment, what happens in the moments of crisis. And it's like, obviously it's a kind of, it's said a lot, but the quote that Luxemburg takes from Engels about you reach a critical moment in the economy where people have a choice between socialism and barbarism. And the reason why that's an important idea is not because it's not that, it's that because liberalism is so deeply ideological, more ideological than fascism and socialism, because what it says is there's a bunch of workers and those workers are good for you, and the boss is making more money is good for you, and you're just a stupid racist if you don't agree with that to white people who are working class. Whereas fascists are like, you're standing in line before you're getting a job to get a job, and your family's hungry and everything, and you're waiting. It's feeding back. Maybe you guys should mute it. Yeah. Thanks. It's like, when you're waiting in line, if you stand and your family's hungry and you're not, and there's huge amounts of austerity and there's not really a strong social wage, and you see that half the people are black and brown, it's a logical extension that you'll say, oh, well, if this half wasn't there, then I'd have an easier job feeding my family. It's not that people are necessarily racist. That's why I have a problem with people saying, oh, all the people who supported Trump are fascists. It's like, well, where were they 8 years ago or 4 years ago when they voted for the black guy named Barack Hussein Obama? I mean, I'm not a big fan of his, but clearly they're not fascists. Or at the other extent, you have people, academics who are saying, oh, no, it's all colonial nostalgia, imperial nostalgia. I'm like, well, what's Hindu nationalism? Is that nostalgia for Ram Janmabhoomi, a land that didn't even exist? You go to Finland, the Finnish right is like Finnish sagas. It exists. It's like the right always is nostalgic for a time that didn't exist. It's nothing particular to this area, but what that kind of politics reproduces is the idea that these racists are immovable and they have no material basis for why they're thinking these racist things. The socialists and communists and others on the left need to argue that it's actually the rich, and we need to organize against that. And that's much less ideological than the liberal position. That's why liberalism is a dead end in during forms of crisis. And to go back, I think really, and if people haven't really engaged with Theodore Allen's work on the invention of whiteness, it's, I think, the most important text in trying to understand how these ideas even came up in the first place. It came up in Southern Virginia in the mid-1600s when the landowners saw that there was a crisis about to happen. So they construct an identity with Europeans who were fighting for thousands of years against each other, saying you're all one people. And now take these scraps. Fast forward 200 years later, and in the Civil War, they're fighting and dying in the mud for a system that keeps them from labor. They're preserving a system that exploits them. And that's not that different from what's happening now. And I think it's important to look to that to analyze how we can confront it.
Amazing. So I guess this time, can you hear me?
It's kind of weird. It sounds like a robot.
Is it? No. Oh, no. Gargi, can you hear me? Oh. Okay.
This is what post-racial organising sounds like when we all kind of throw off our particularism.
You know, one of the things that seems to get missed is that there has always been a class of white people within white people who have experienced this level of precarity, right? And that often gets missed. You know, it's very easy to sort of think at a top level when we're theorizing the world through the thoughts of thinkers who are trying to provide post hoc justifications for what has already happened and the processes which have already happened. And I think those white people who experience that degree of precarity, you know, there's also like a whole conversation to be had about this sort of pre-Second World War moment. But those white people who experience that degree of precarity have often been the same white people who've organized in solidarity with the oppressed around the world, right? And I think, you know, there's a tendency when we look at it, just as Ashok was just saying, you know, simply as a form of nostalgia, to overlook this history of the possibility of struggling together. And I think that's why so many in the Black Marxist tradition, but also just so many in the Marxist tradition, emphasize this process of struggle as being something which can rid us or disabuse us of some of these identities, because it suddenly makes it obvious that these identities are entirely arbitrary and these identities don't speak to a common or shared experience. And I think really that's where our energies should be lying in terms of explicating it, providing a language for this in terms of how we think about and do politics. The other thing I wanted to say, sorry, that kind of disorientated me a little bit with my Dalek voice, but the like sort of final thing I wanted to say is, I think conversations like this, I'm so grateful to both of you for coming on today. I'm so grateful because actually, even through the process of this conversation, it's helped clarify a lot of things in my mind. But I think one of the things that's sort of important as a takeaway from this is this notion that whilst what is around us, the language of neoliberalism and the ideology of neoliberalism seems completely insurmountable, can be quite, you know, depressing to think. The reality of the situation is there have been moments in history which felt as totalizing as this, right? You know, if you were a peasant subsisting on your land, it was inconceivable that you would be able to live a life in which you weren't controlled by a master and weren't controlled by a lord, sorry. And so I guess in this moment, this relative lull, I think it's a time to be doing some thinking and some rethinking. It's a time to be returning to certain texts. It's a time to be connecting and trying to find connections with people, not just within our local sphere, but also more generally in the international. But I also think it's a time for preparing. Maybe I'm a utopian. I'm not. But I do think that this sort of drawback is preparing us for some kind of, and we're beginning to see the cracks. We're beginning to see that. I mean, I said when we were talking about the Black Lives Matter post-George Floyd moment, you know, if you're a young Black kid who experiences your Blackness as the most important aspect of your identity and experiences your Blackness in opposition to all other ethnic groups, you go on a march and you look around you, you see black, you see brown, you see white. Those are the things which completely transform your view of the world. If you see someone like Kamala Harris running for vice president, ex-cop, putting people in prison, fully participating in the sort of like process of mass incarceration, that's when you begin to unpick a lot of these ideas in people's minds, and that's when you begin to make some headway. And I do think maybe this Biden-Kamala ticket, this Biden-Harris ticket, and also, you know, some of the analysis that we're hearing coming out of a sort of liberal bourgeois Black class who are trying to cling to that relative privilege within the context of the bourgeoisie that blackness has conferred on them, and the notion of them as being oppressed and, you know, a protected class has conferred on them. The analysis that they're producing, which is showing itself to be profoundly anti-worker, to be profoundly anti-poor, is beginning to make people ask more questions. And I think that's being evidenced by the kind of output, cultural output, political output that we're seeing today as well. So I guess that was kind of my final rallying cry, to not get too disheartened.
I want to say something about that,
but
because I don't at all feel despondent. I think we're in a dangerous moment because all bets are off, and partly all bets are off because of global pandemic, which in some of the ways that you're saying has stripped off all of that liberal veneer that Ashok is talking about the pretense that we have different alliances. Look, they're letting some of us die in the street. If you can't see the class line, then you're not going to see it. And of course, around the world, it means lots of people see, oh, now I understand. I don't need wages of whiteness. My old folk are dying just the same as everyone else's. That means something is up for grabs. But the moment of opportunity is always a moment of danger, isn't it? Because the powerful don't think, oh, I'll sit back now. Oh, it's a fair cop. Now they all seen it. What they do is they rally their forces and their armies and their weapons, and we're also seeing that. But that moment when the kickback is so open, that means something's afoot, something's at stake, isn't it? Definitely. I think soon, you know, Zoom is just like the weekend date, but the rest of the week, it's all happening then. And you should all feel that.
I kind of feel like we should end it there because I don't